Hi, writers and readers. How are you guys doing today? It is another gray Sunday. Isn't that funny? The past two Sundays have been gray, and today is gray and rainy. I have a very interesting topic today that is from Michael J Elliott, and he is here right now, which is great. Hi, Mike. Hi, JB, Travis, Amber, and Joe. Thank you guys so much for coming. It's awesome to see you here. Today's topic is going to be historical accuracy in dialogue, and I have a lot of things to share with you about this, so I'm excited. The first thing I want to say, though, is unrelated. It's just about YouTube, so real quick, I just want to say you guys probably know the situation with YouTube and their demonetization and everything they're doing. That means that if you don't have 1,000 subscribers or something like either 4,000, now I'm forgetting if it's minutes or hours worth of watches per month, it's probably minutes, you are demonetized. So what happens is, even though this hasn't actually happened yet, it's like February 20th, I think they've already changed their algorithm because views are starting to tank for me. I've heard the same for everyone else. And I wanted to say to you guys that that doesn't matter to me. I'm still going to be doing these. I don't care. It would be nice if YouTube didn't do that, but you know, it's a vicious cycle where they sort of say, oh, you're not making any money, we're not going to promote you, you can't find no new viewers, which means you can't be monetized, which means we won't promote you. It's a circle. So I just wanted to sort of assure you guys that I'm still going to be here. I don't care. It's not the point for me at all. But if you want to see my videos, just make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because there have been a number of people who have an issue with even their subscription box for people who are no longer making money, even if you never earned a check making money. So just make sure that you hit the notification bell so you can see when I go live. And if you guys have a place that you'd rather see me make videos that's more convenient for you or anything, let me know that too. Because at this point, I don't really care where I'm doing it as long as I get to do it. So let me know. Okay, let's get right into this topic. And I see more people. Thank you for coming, Joshua. Anita, thank you. Great to see you guys. So I have a number of things to say, like I said, and I wanted to share with you a quote before I get started. As always, I have some little notes over here, so that's where I'm looking. But I wanted to share this quote. I wanted to put it on the screen. Google Toolbox isn't working today. So if you want to see the quote, it's on my Instagram. The quote is from an author named Mark Lehner, and he says, "As far as what I do, my value as a writer is certainly not to try to recapitulate a 19th century form. Certain styles of narrative don't conform to my style of experiencing the world." And I think that's a perfect quote for what we're talking about today, because even though we may be talking about the 19th century or the 11th century or whenever we're talking about, we do view the world very differently, and it may not be your goal to sound exactly like people from that time. So the first thing I want to bring up is basically you need to decide on the balance between accuracy to the time period and readability. So I talked about this a little bit last week, and I have a couple of examples here that I want to read to you. So as you know, like, the way people spoke was very, very different, especially if you look at the 19th century. It was super stiff, you know, and the readability then can be kind of low. You're going to be getting people who want to read Jane Austen, you know, and you may not be able to break the barrier into modern readers who like historical fiction but don't want to read that time period's dialogue. It can be hard to break into for them. So I wanted to read you an example from a couple of books, and I have from different time periods, how this works sometimes. And here I have one from Villette, which is from the 1800s. This is a 19th century one. And then I'll have a different one. This is Charlotte Bronte from a totally different period. So she says, this is just a random quote. The context doesn't matter at all. "Indeed, ma'am, I consider your expression of the least ceremonious. Miss Home, I should certainly have said, in venturing to speak of the gentlewoman to whom I allude." Now, fine for the time period, but may be difficult for some readers to really get into something that's written that way. So everybody loves, like, if you love a classic book, this is what you're looking for. This is your cup of tea. But if you're a modern reader who isn't into that time period so much and just likes the fiction with historical accents, that's going to be tough to get into if you try to write that way. So it's up to you completely what you want to do. But for me, for example, I just didn't see it as feasible. First of all, I feel like it's difficult to keep that up. If you're going to keep that level of speech up, you better be really on top of it, because you slip once into something modern and people are going to catch it right away. It's going to come across as not as authentic. But, you know, you sort of go do a nice in between and you won't have those kinds of problems, you know? So that's one of the points I wanted to bring up. Hi, Rebecca. I wanted to make sure you guys are aware that there are different ways of writing, you know, and you can want to be in that time period, but not make it difficult accessibility wise to everyone, you know, who could pick up your book. Imagine if they pick up your book expecting something that they find is readable and it's really hard for them. So it's again, like I said, I'm not trying to discourage you. Either way you want to go, but that's the difference between readability and for a modern reader and doing it so historically accurate that only someone who wants to read that time period would be willing to pick up the book. So I have another example here. This is a Sharon K. Penman book, and she's well known for her historical fiction and accuracy and all that. This one is Here Be Dragons. So this is more of a 12th century time period. And I wanted to tell you that this is kind of interesting. Listen to this dialogue and tell me if this doesn't sound a little bit modern to you. And then I'll tell you why it's surprising. Hi, Lillian. So again, context doesn't matter so much. And then when I say Mold, it's a town, I think. So the first person says, "Are you sure, Tom, we needed no escort from Hawarden?" And then the second person says, "Damn sure, Mold is but 6 miles from Hawarden. Moreover, the Welsh dare not trespass in these parts. They're not ones to risk their necks unless the odds are rigged in their favor. So you need not fret. I'll get you there safe enough." Now, you can see like the little bits that clearly make it sound like an older, you know, piece, like it was written in a different, for a different time period to represent a different time period. It's the way that they're speaking with, I mean, she's even using contractions here, and it seems like it's a good mix of modern and back from that century. However, let me read you something you're going to be surprised about. Now, this is a book that is nonfiction. It's called Life in a Medieval City, by Joseph and Frances Guise, I want to say. And the reason I'm going to read to you from here is because this has quotes from the time period. This is written stuff from the same century, and you will be surprised how modern it sounds. This is straight from someone's writing. He's writing about when a city caught fire. At about the 9th hour, during an extraordinarily violent south wind, a fire broke out, by which 3 houses were half destroyed. While the citizens were assembling and bringing the fire under control, cinders and sparks, carried aloft by the wind, were deposited upon the church, and being driven between the joints of the lead roof, remained there among the old timber rafters, to which they soon set fire. From these the fire was communicated to the larger beams and braces, no one yet perceiving. Okay. I mean, that sounds pretty modern, doesn't it? It's kind of shocking. So this is where last time, in my last live stream, I said that sometimes when you write in the time period, it can sound modern anyway. And sometimes the believability may go down because people might say, that phrasing sounds too modern. Well, guess what? It was. That's how they spoke. So I don't know how many of you are surprised by that, but I was surprised by that when I read it. This is a really good book, by the way. I have a lot of resources on Victorian fiction, Victorian time period, nonfiction, and medieval as well. So that's a good one. They've written several books that are helpful. But my point is, the 12th century sounds more modern than the 19th century. Interesting. So don't be afraid to do something that is an in-between feel of modern and a different century. Don't be afraid of that. It's not so unbelievable as you might think, like when you're sort of struggling with the idea of what you should do. Michael J Elliott is saying, contractions pulled me out of that, Christie. Yeah, it's surprising. The contractions I wouldn't put in, honestly, myself. I wouldn't put that into 19th century. I would not do that. But yeah, Sharon K. Penman did it. She's world renowned, you know. It's up to you. But I think the lack of contractions, if you do a lack of contractions, that automatically sort of helps put it in the time period you want it. Any older time period, it's going to automatically sound older. So another thing I wanted to bring up is last time I mentioned that you can look at a dictionary from the time period or even at works from the time period. Like I just read you, that's nonfiction, and that has the kinds of words, the kind of phrasing they would use. So if you study that even a little bit, doesn't have to be crazy in depth, you're going to get the feel for it. You're going to start thinking that way. And that can help you a lot. But if you get a dictionary from the time period, that can help as well. If you want to go that detailed, I certainly do that with my books. I look at a 19th century dictionary. I see, did this word exist? Did that word exist? Does this phrase make sense for the time period? What's the etymology? It's actually easier than you think and doesn't take quite as much time as you may think. A lot of other research takes tons of time. This does not. This is on the easier side. So another one that I wanted to hit on is the tone. Are you doing a formal tone? Are you doing something more informal? And that can depend on the class of the family, just the characters that you have. So I wanted to give you an example from my book, actually, because I did a lot of research on how should the tone sound. And I'd say that's probably, when you're writing dialogue, one thing that can be a little bit trickier. For me, it was tricky. Michael J Elliott says, wow, I didn't know those sorts of dictionaries were available. You'd be surprised, Michael J Elliott, and go check him out on the Dark Realm Diaries. By the way, he's on YouTube. So you'd be surprised because I actually found mine. It was free. It was just a Google resource. It's public domain. So just try to search for that kind of thing. And you may be surprised what you find. I thought I'd have to pay a ton of money for something like that. Free. So give it a shot. One of the things in my book, Lock and Key, was that I have some characters who are just middle class or middle upper class, anything like that, where they speak perfectly fine. It's not like super refined, but it's just a normal way of speaking. And I have another character who is an orphan. He was orphaned, and he really doesn't speak very well. And so I had to really look. I looked at some Charles Dickens, and I was trying to get a hold of what are the letters. See, that's English. So it's, British English is a little bit different than American, but still, I was using it just to try and see where are letters clipped. What types of things make it sound like an actual dialogue that somebody, is speaking when they're lower class in that time period. And so I just wanted to read you the difference between these two characters to help you guys out in what a difference it can make to the feel of these characters if you spend time doing that. So the first character is saying, what interests you in working back here on locks and keys instead of in the front, John asks. The front is easier work. I'm sure you've noticed. And then the next character says, I don't like dealing with people so much as dealing with metal and wood, Timothy said. He waited to see if his own frankness and natural way of speaking would be accepted. And that's one thing I put on purpose, because everyone speaks normally except him. So sort of that can affect you a little bit, if you're, for me in this case, this is the apprentice speaking. He's the lowest form. So it's kind of awkward for him being not very good speech, And his next line, I'm skipping over what John says because he speaks normally. He says, Timothy says, nice to have something in common with someone here. Can I ask you something? And then another line, you've worked lots of places, I'm sure. Is this what it's always like? So you can see, I try to make it readable, because one thing you want to be careful of is if you do a different accent or you do a different class level, if you make it too hard to read, people aren't going to be able to literally understand the words. So just be careful of that. You can ask for a second set of eyes, anything like that, and just make sure it's readable. I was super careful with that in this, so I hope it came across right. But it does create a totally different feel for that character. It is part of his character development. And you can look at other works, like I said, Charles Dickens with orphans and things like that, to try and figure out, does this sound like, am I really differentiating, and does it sound like the time period at the same time? So I think that makes a big difference. Bye, Rebecca. Thanks for stopping in. Oh, thank you so much, Amber. She's saying the detailed research makes a really big difference to books, and she's paying me a compliment. Thank you so much. I think that's what takes them over the top. Great stories, yes, but all that detailed research really polishes them. Yeah, I agree. And JB says tone is very challenging. Keeping up with it is hardest, even more difficult than dialogue. Yeah, and both of them are the same. The tone, of the dialogue, the tone of the narration. And again, like you kind of want to keep readers in that time period with the narration as well. Hi, Mike. I'm glad you made it too. So yeah, that is tough. And I'll tell you, I said this in live streams before, but maybe it was on Go Indie now. One thing you can do is sort of separate out the quotes or the dialogue from different characters, whether you print it out and you highlight them or whatever. And you can read just those dialogues, like just everything else, just don't think about it. And you can read just those dialogues that are from a particular character to make sure that it is consistent and to make sure that it sounds right. And then you can also, I mean, you can do that with each person, which I tend to do just to make sure I don't make any slips and like mix characters up by accident. It happens to everyone. We have a lot of people in our head. You need to keep them straight. So that's one easier way to just make sure your tone is always the same with these characters. Thanks, Mike. He says, the other Mike, Michael J Elliott. Yep, never once felt pulled out of the moment with Anatomy of a Darkened Heart. I'm really glad to hear that. Thank you so much for telling me. So another thing I wanted to bring up is, this is a brief one, but just how much would people really say out loud? So that is something that is especially the case for 19th century, maybe 17th century, 18th century too, probably. There was so many limitations on what you could and couldn't say. And so it gets frustrating sometimes when you watch something like Downton Abbey. I always use that as an example because it's super popular. Downton Abbey, the Forsyte Saga, any of those things. You watch these people and you say, why won't they say what they should be saying? It's so frustrating, you know, and it's because they really couldn't in the time period. A lot of times there were subjects that were totally off limits. There were things women just couldn't say. They weren't allowed. And so that can be not allowed as in, you know, in their culture, they would be looked down upon. Their reputation may go down, that kind of stuff. And so when you get into that, you can kind of see like, okay, well, if I have a character who's a real outcast and they say these things that women shouldn't be saying, well, that kind of puts them in the right place, right? So if their dialogue sort of matches their personality in that way, they're saying stuff that would cause them to be an outcast too, talking about things that they wouldn't normally talk about. There's just another way that you can sort of use dialogue in your character development. So that's just one small thing I wanted to mention. It does make a difference though. And another thing was, if you decide that you want to have like a letter, if you want to have a newspaper article, if you want to have a magazine, an advertisement, anything like that, I really strongly recommend looking that stuff up from the time period. And you can find it. It depends on probably what time period you're looking at. I'm sure some are more difficult than others. But for example, I'm always going to use 19th century because that's my time period that I write in. But I have a couple of things. I have newspaper. I have a few newspaper clippings that are in Lock and Key. And so let me just read you a small portion. I'm not going to read the whole article. It's only half a page, but still. Let me read this to you. And I'll tell you the process I went through to get it this way. It says, and I'm not giving anything away. You're not going to know who did what or why. So it says, a rare and particularly violent incident occurred on the night of May 30th. Neighbors of Mr. and Mrs. Hevig of Cherry Street were alarmed when they heard loud noises followed by a man's horrific scream coming from the Hevig home. Upon emerging from their dwellings, several residents witnessed an unknown man running down the dimly lit street. After giving chase and with much difficulty, they apprehended him and brought him to the constable. And then it goes on just a little bit longer. All right, that sounds easy enough, but you may have like a couple of questions about, did they really write that way? Let me tell you something. You'd be surprised. 19th century articles about murder and about anything sort of gossipy or, you know, dramatic, they were dramatic writers. They really were. If you look up articles from that time period that are newspaper clippings about murders and stuff, you'd be shocked at the amount of drama they infuse into these things. The words they use, like when I say a man's horrific scream, I'm toning it down from what they used to do. But what I did was at first I wrote it a certain way. I thought it was okay. I compared it to newspaper articles. I sent it to my editor and said, here's a couple of newspaper articles that I'm trying to make this sound similar to. Can you help and make suggestions? Like, does this work? Is it too little? Is it too much? So my editor returned it to me and she had given me an example, a rewriting. I always go with the same editors in my company, which is Proof Positive, proofpositivepro.com if you're interested. And so my editor said, okay, I reworked this, see what you think of it. And she wrote it very similar to the newspaper style. Well, let me tell you, it was brilliant, but as a reader, I read it and I was like, I just don't believe that those words would have been used as a reader. It was true. It was 100% accurate. When you compare between the two, I was like, this is perfect. You wouldn't even know it was written now in modern times. But I thought, our reader is going to buy this. And I really didn't think they would. I ran that past her. She agreed with me. And so we toned it down to this. And like I said, surprisingly, it's toned down. So that was the process I went through. It was tough the first time, easier after. But that's the level of detail that you can go to make sure that it's believable to readers, but also accurate. Okay, so I'm going to share another thing with you, which is you're probably saying like, okay, but how do I find this stuff? Well, I'll tell you, newspaper articles, especially from the 19th century, are really easy to find. Just look up whatever subject you're looking for, article 19th century, easy peasy, no problem there. I found plenty, no problem. I even found the way that they were set up, like the layout in the newspaper, if I wanted to do that. So this is another thing that you can find sometimes at auctions, at old bookstores, anything like that. You never know where you're going to find it. Now, the Delineator is a magazine that was really popular in the 19th century. Now, I found this compilation book, and it's 1883 to 1890. So it's a little bit past my time period where I've been writing, but still it's along the same lines. I can get a really clear idea of how magazine articles were written. I can get a clear idea of what they talked about, and I can get a clear idea of what kinds of pictures they included, advertisements, stuff like that. So in this one, I just want to share so you can see like the level of detail. You can see all these articles. It's, oh my God, the tiniest printing, the prints, stuff like that. If you look up 19th century advertisements, you can find plenty of them, and they're a bit strange, to be honest. They're really weird. But this is a particular fashion magazine, so I use this heavily to try to see what were the fashions of that time period really like, because we watch things like Downton Abbey, and again, it's high class, wealthy class people. You know, I'm looking for average people. And so I'm going to get like this kind of magazine. I'm going to get, you know, if I was writing in the 1900s, Joshua, this probably doesn't, I mean, I'm sure that I don't think you're writing about like women's fashions or anything, but Joshua is writing a 1930s to 40s anthropomorphic piece, I think. And so like if he wanted to include stuff that was, you know, anything to do with women's magazines, the way that a magazine read, fashions, whatever, he could actually get a copy, an old copy, and maybe even find it online of Women's Cosmopolitan, which goes back then. Did you know that? It's pretty interesting. But I use that stuff all the time. That's my main source. We look at a lot of fashion prints on Pinterest. We think it's accurate, and it's been mislabeled. That's frustrating. Things like the Delineator also have, I'm just trying to flip to see if I can catch one, but it also has things like what was the etiquette at the time. And so I read some of that stuff about calling cards and stuff like that I could then look up in my time period. And it helped me a lot. It really helped me sort of figure out, okay, well, how do people actually visit people? Here's what I was looking for. If you look, it's a big one. If you look down here, there is social life, and you can find what exactly was going on at the time, how it was done, what their social lives were like. And there's a lot of stuff about etiquette, because believe it or not, it was tough for women back then to even figure out their own etiquette sometimes. They make a lot of suggestions as to what you should do. They make a lot of suggestions as to what has changed this season. You know, and so those kinds of details can also be like a really big deal to make your story more believable, set it more in the time period, all of that. So these resources are totally invaluable in my opinion. And if you know you're going to be writing a lot of historical fiction in one period, I would strongly suggest that you get your hands on this kind of stuff, or look it up and try to find it public domain online. There's a lot of stuff there, and it's not so hard to find. JB is saying, what about foul language? I know one must be careful with it as some words mean different things and some weren't even around yet. Well, it's a good question, JB. And sometimes you can look up slang from the time period. And the tricky thing about that is when you look up slang, you need to look up sort of who was using this slang. You know, if you're writing middle class or lower class, maybe they would use it. I'm not sure. You have to look for your time period. But if it's a wealthy person, maybe only in private, maybe not even. So, you know, that kind of thing. I've seen plenty of slang pages and dictionaries. I would double check. If you find like a website that has a lot of slang, I would double check that it was from that time period. And if you can, how it was used, you can see people find that interesting. And so I think there are a lot more resources on that than you may even think. JB says they had some real flair back then. They were like the Ric Flair of journalists. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what I would recommend. If you can look up like, you know, I don't know, curse words from the 19th century or something, you may find it. I know there's slang out there. I know there's slang, at least glossary listings and stuff that you can look up and just figure out how to use it. And sure, that puts you more in the time period. Just make sure that the class you're writing about would use it. That's all I would say. Michael J Elliott is saying, Christie, what about the cultural diffs, like American English and word usage as different as it is now in the 19th century? Say you have a British character interacting with an American character. Well, that's a really good point. And I have to say, one of the difficult things about working, about setting my book, my 19th century book in America, is that everything I look up is automatically British. That's just what's popular, you know, 19th century British, UK in general. It's just the most popular thing. We have all those wonderful classical works from back then, and that's what people want to see enacted. So I have to be super careful when I do my research that if I find something, did this actually happen in America? When did it reach America? Like, that's tough. So you're saying about cultural differences. I'll tell you, British English and British anything from the 19th century, way easier to find than American. So you could look that up and then like have your website, like for example, if you look something up, you have your website on the one side for British, and then on the other side, you're like, okay, here's my American. Let me see what were the differences, because some of their like tea stuff, when they have tea, afternoon tea, or whether they had afternoon tea, what they used, it was different. I'll tell you, a lot of times you can find resources on that. You'll have like, for example, afternoon tea was a certain thing in British, I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head, in England, and it was at a certain time, and the intention was this. But it didn't make it to America until this time, you know? And so those differences can make a difference. Like if you're in the time period when afternoon tea just came in England, you could have like the two characters talking. One is British, one is American. And the American's like, oh, I've heard of that. That's interesting. Like, we don't have that yet, you know? So that kind of stuff, you know, it's as you do your research that you find this kind of stuff. And you can look up 19th century America versus England or something, and you can probably find some stuff on that. But I would say I've discovered the most just through researching naturally. And like I said, you can look back at, for example, you know, Charlotte Bronte, and you can look back at Charles Dickens, and you can compare and contrast by yourself. You know, you can take it straight from that literature. You can take it straight from, let's say you get a dictionary, or you get a magazine or something like that from the time period, and one's English and one's British and one's American. That can help too. But I would say, you know, try doing it straight out if you want to. American culture, 19th century, British culture, 19th century. See if you can compare and contrast. Look in the different books and see what you can find. I think that makes it a lot more in depth, Michael. I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think that's a good one. So I hope I answered that okay. I haven't had to do it myself, so I'm just telling you what I would do. That's my recommendation. But you could definitely have them. I mean, you could definitely have them. They'll have some things in common and a lot not. Because like I said, things reached America later than they did. They would start out in England or Paris and make their way to America. So you can try that. So So I hope that this was helpful for you guys. I really enjoyed putting this together and finding different examples for you. I love sharing my resources. If you have any additional questions, just leave them down below in the comments, and I'm really always happy to try and find an answer for you or tell you my experience. And I really love your questions too. They make me think, that, especially that question about America versus England back in the 19th century and how you're distinguishing between the two. That's a real good one. So I'll let you know if I have any additional information on that when I go back to my resources. But thank you as always for coming. Hit the notification bell down below if you want to be notified when I go live again. I'm really only doing live streams now for the most part. And like I said, if you have a place you'd rather see me posting videos that's more convenient or anything, let me know. I'm not tied to this platform anymore, so it's totally fine for me to move on. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, or for some of you, enjoy your night or sleep, whatever you're about to do. And I will see you again next week, Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Bye.